When Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995, the world lost a legend. The man who defined cool with a smile, a song, and a drink in his hand. But behind that easy charm was someone completely different from the carefree image the public adored. For decades, Dean quietly built a hidden empire, one planned with precision, discipline, and love. He didn't just earn money, he designed a future. Every contract he signed, every show he produced, and every investment he made had a purpose. And when his family finally uncovered what he had left behind, they were overwhelmed, not just by the fortune itself, but by the care and foresight behind it. This is the untold story of how a man who seemed to live for the moment spent his life preparing for tomorrow, and how the truth about his secret legacy brought his family to tears. The man behind the smile. Born Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7, 1917 in Steubenville, Ohio, Dean Martin came into the world with little more than his parents' determination. His father, an Italian barber named Gaetano, and his mother, Angela, a seamstress, worked tirelessly to provide for their children through the Great Depression. They spoke only Italian at home, so when young Dino started school, he couldn't understand a word his teachers said. The other children mocked him for his accent and his foreign name, calling him Dago. He quickly learned to survive not with his fists but with his wit. Humor became his shield. That ability to charm, to win people over through laughter, would become the foundation of his entire life. By 16, Dino had had enough of school and set out to earn a living. He hauled steel, dealt blackjack in smoky back rooms, and even fought as a welterweight boxer under the name Kid Crochet. He won only one of his 12 fights but learned something more valuable than victory: resilience. He discovered that the world rewarded toughness, composure, and the ability to take a hit, lessons that would later serve him well in Hollywood. Still, the one thing that haunted him was his parents' struggle. He saw them work endlessly for meager returns and understood early that money was not about luxury. It was about freedom. When he began earning from singing in small clubs, he didn't waste a dollar. He saved, recorded every expense, and treated every contract like a chess move. This financial discipline became his secret weapon. The man who seemed so laid back on stage was, in reality, one of the most calculated figures in the entertainment business. By the 1940s, Dino reinvented himself as Dean Martin, teaming up with a wild, energetic comedian named Jerry Lewis. Together they became the most electrifying duo in America, dominating radio, nightclubs, and eventually Hollywood films. But while Jerry was obsessed with comedy and performance, Dean was focused on longevity. He negotiated for royalties, residuals, and ownership rights, concepts few entertainers understood at the time. His contracts reflected a deep understanding that fame fades, but rights endure. To the audience, Dean Martin was the effortless crooner, the man with a song on his lips and a drink in his hand. But behind the smile was a survivor, a man forged in poverty, driven by purpose, and quietly preparing for a future no one else could see: the Vegas vision. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Dean Martin was more than a singer. He was a phenomenon. And there was only one place in America where that kind of fame could truly live forever: Las Vegas. The desert city was booming, transforming from a dusty gambling stop into a glittering empire of lights and money. To most entertainers, Vegas was a playground. To Dean, it was an opportunity, a chessboard on which he could secure his legacy. At the Sands Hotel, where he performed alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., Dean quietly began to rewrite the rules of show business. Other performers demanded enormous appearance fees, pocketing quick cash that would vanish as fast as it came. Dean took the opposite approach. Instead of the highest paycheck, he wanted a piece of the action, small ownership stakes in the casinos themselves. 0.5% here, 0.25% there. They looked insignificant on paper, but they came with one powerful clause: perpetuity. Those shares would remain his or his family's as long as the properties existed. At first, even Sinatra thought he was crazy. Why take less up front? Why risk everything on the future? But Dean wasn't guessing. He was calculating. He saw beyond the flashing lights and smoky lounges. He understood that the true wealth of Las Vegas wasn't in applause, but in the land beneath it. When casino ownership began consolidating in the 1980s and 1990s, those small equity pieces exploded in value. One stake he had bought for $150,000 in the 1960s ended up paying more than $12 million in buyouts, and he had several such positions. Dean's business partners often said he was the calmest man in any negotiation. He'd sit back, sip his so-called bourbon, which was often apple juice, and quietly ask the one question that mattered. "Do I get a piece of the house?" That line became his signature. While others gambled at the tables, he was gambling on the city itself, and every single time, he won. Years later, after his passing, when his family's lawyers revealed the full details of his Las Vegas holdings, his children were speechless. The old contracts, yellowed with time, contained terms so forward-thinking they felt almost modern. The man they had seen as carefree and detached had in fact been playing a long, careful game, one built not on chance, but on vision. Dean Martin hadn't just conquered Las Vegas. He owned a piece of it, the television empire. If Las Vegas made Dean Martin rich, television made him eternal. In 1965, when NBC approached him to host his own variety program, Dean agreed, but only on his terms. What he negotiated next would quietly change television history. He formed his own production company, Claude Productions, to own and produce The Dean Martin Show, licensing it back to NBC rather than selling it outright. At a time when networks owned nearly every frame they broadcast, Dean was one of the first major entertainers to secure full creative and financial control of his work. To Hollywood insiders, it looked like a vanity move. In truth, it was a masterstroke, For 9 years, The Dean Martin Show ruled American television. Airing from 1965 to 1974, it combined musical performances, comedy sketches, and celebrity appearances, all anchored by Dean's relaxed charisma. The show drew millions of viewers weekly and earned him a Golden Globe in 1966 for Best Actor in a Television Series. Yet while the public saw a man laughing his way through cue cards, the businessman behind the scenes was building a structure that would pay dividends for generations. By owning the show, Dean controlled its syndication, reruns, and distribution rights. When the variety format began to fade, Dean pivoted again, launching the Dean Martin Celebrity Roasts in 1974. These specials, featuring Hollywood legends poking fun at one another, became cultural phenomena, airing for more than a decade. Once again, Dean owned the format and content outright through Claude Productions. What others saw as comedy specials, he saw as intellectual property. Decades later, as television evolved into cable, DVD, and eventually digital streaming, those old recordings found new life and new revenue. Each time they aired, streamed, or were packaged for collectors, the payments flowed directly to his estate, not to NBC or a studio. Media analysts now estimate that the Dean Martin Show and Celebrity Roasts catalog still generates millions annually. For his family, discovering how carefully Dean had protected these rights was overwhelming. His daughter Dina later admitted she wept when lawyers explained how her father had structured the deals. "He was thinking 50 years ahead," she said. Dean's effortless on-screen charm masked one of the sharpest business minds in entertainment. Behind the jokes and whiskey glass, he wasn't just a performer, he was a visionary. Every rerun, every clip, Every nostalgic moment that keeps his image alive today is proof of the empire he quietly built behind the laughter. The music that never stopped paying. Dean Martin's music wasn't just the soundtrack of the 1950s and 60s. It was the heartbeat of an era. That's Amore, Volare, Ain't That a Kick in the Head, Everybody Loves Somebody. These songs captured the charm, wit, and warmth that made him one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. But behind the romance of his melodies was a man thinking like an investor. While most of his peers sang for a paycheck, Dean was quietly building ownership, piece by piece, song by song. In the early 1960s, when artists routinely signed away publishing rights to labels, Dean refused to play by those rules. He demanded partial ownership of his masters and insisted on reversion clauses that would return full control of his recordings after a certain number of years. Music executives at Capitol and Reprise Records often called him stubborn. In reality, he was one of the few who understood that the true value of music wasn't in the hit single, it was in its lifespan. He didn't just want to make records, he wanted to own them. At the time, the industry couldn't grasp the concept of long-term residual income, but Dean could. His songs became staples on radio, television, and in films. And as technology evolved, so did their profitability. When CDs arrived, the catalog sold again. When streaming took over, his music found a whole new audience across Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Analysts estimate that the Martin music catalog has grown over 800% in value since his death in 1995, now worth tens of millions of dollars. The royalties continue to flow into his estate, a steady stream of income that has outlived nearly every artist of his generation. His son Richie once said that realizing the size of his father's music fortune was both shocking and emotional. "Dad always said he worked for the long haul," he told a friend. "I just never knew how true that was." And it wasn't just the love songs that paid off. Dean's holiday recordings, especially Marshmallow World and Let It Snow, have become seasonal fixtures, played in shopping malls, movies, and commercials around the world every Christmas. For the man who used to joke that he only worked to afford his next round of golf, the truth was far deeper. Dean Martin had quietly crafted one of the most sustainable and timeless musical legacies in modern history, a legacy that continues to sing and pay long after his final curtain. Real estate, investments, and the trust that made them cry. While Dean Martin's voice filled every radio and nightclub in America, his money was quietly building a fortress of security behind the scenes. Starting in the 1950s, long before celebrity wealth management became an industry, Dean began investing his earnings into something tangible: land. He bought modest homes, income-generating apartments, and small commercial properties across California, Nevada, and Colorado. Unlike most stars who spent their fortunes on yachts and parties, Dean believed in the power of steady appreciation. "Land doesn't disappear," he once told a close friend. "You can't drink it, gamble it, or forget where you put it." His real estate strategy was remarkably conservative yet visionary. In Malibu, he bought a small cliffside retreat when the area was still wild and affordable. In Palm Springs, he acquired a mid-century modern home that would later become a cultural landmark, drawing countless fans who still photograph it today. His Beverly Hills estate, purchased in the 1970s for just $120,000, was sold for $1.35 million 3 years after his death, and would later be torn down, replaced by a mansion now valued at nearly $28 million. Dean's eye for location and timing was impeccable. But it wasn't only property. He invested in blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and long-term trust accounts, diversifying with quiet precision. Friends said he never bragged about his wealth and rarely discussed numbers, but he read financial reports every morning over coffee. To those who knew him, the biggest surprise wasn't how much he made, it was how little he wasted. The greatest revelation came after his death in 1995, when his family began reviewing his estate. Inside a collection of leather-bound binders were decades of handwritten notes, each page labeled with a child's or grandchild's name. He hadn't simply divided his fortune. He had designed a system of purpose. Some funds were reserved for education, others for creative ventures, and others as safety nets for times of hardship. Instead of letting lawyers dictate every clause, Dean created a family council, ensuring that future generations would make financial decisions together with transparency and compassion. Even more moving were the personal letters he left behind. One granddaughter received hers on her 30th birthday, a simple, heartfelt message reminding her to stay kind, stay curious, and never forget where you come from. For a man once seen as emotionally distant, these gestures revealed a depth few had imagined. Dean Martin's estate was valued at around $30 million, about $65 million today, but those who loved him insist the real wealth lay elsewhere. His final gift wasn't money. It was proof that beneath the cool exterior was a man who had loved, planned, and cared with extraordinary foresight. Dean Martin's story is more than the rise of a Hollywood icon. It's the quiet revelation of a man who mastered both art and life. He fooled the world into thinking he didn't care, when in truth, he cared deeply, especially for his family. His voice may have defined an era, but his wisdom defined generations. So what do you think mattered most to Dean Martin, the fame he earned or the future he built for those he loved? Tell us in the comments, and if you'd like to see more stories about the legends who shaped Hollywood's golden age, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next chapter.